Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 415. Thank you so much for joining me. Hope you guys have had a good week. Summertime. It is, we're going to start getting back into some politics in this podcast because we are in an election year. I don't know that I guess it's going to touch on politics. This is going to be politics back in the show. Transition back into politics because we're in an election year and there's a lot going on, a lot that I want to cover. We're also celebrating the country's 250th birthday in a few weeks. The 250th anniversary of the founding of this country, this great country. And I want to talk about that in the opening part of this podcast, and we're going to transition, and I'll explain what I'm going to do. But in the last podcast, I touched briefly about the sack of Rome that happened in 410, and it was the Visigoths and led by Alaric, and they storm and sack Rome, the eternal city. And this is the first time, you can see it says here, this is the first time in almost 800 years that Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. And the sack was a major shock. It was a shock to contemporaries, friends, and foes of the empire. Because you can see here, it says the name of the city is the Eternal City. It was such a monumental event and such a shock when the Visigoths sacked Rome, because they never could have envisioned that the city would ever fall. It was called the Eternal City, still called the Eternal City. And it was a shock to the people of Rome when Rome fell. I said in the last podcast that it was later in the 5th century. It's actually early in the 5th century, 410. And it's significant because the Roman Empire had just converted from paganism to Christianity. And after the Visigoths sacked Rome, many of the Romans, you had just 4 decades before this, the reign of Julian the Apostate. And Julian was a Roman emperor who was preaching and wanting to take the Roman Empire back from Christianity, back to paganism. His whole thing, and that's why he's called Julian the Apostate, is because he wanted to reject the Christianity of Constantine, that Constantine had brought into the empire. He wanted to go back to the pagan gods, their old gods, and he was defeated. Julian's gone, and but 4 decades later, then the city of Rome, the Roman capital, falls, and everybody was like, was Julian right? Should we have gone back to the pagan gods? I mean, what's happened that the city, the Eternal City, has stood for nearly 1,000 years without being sacked by a foreign enemy? And as soon as we convert to Christianity and reject the old pagan gods, the Eternal City falls. This is the way these people thought back then. And that's why Saint Augustine of Hippo, at this period of time, he writes his masterpiece, The City of God, and he has to explain why the city fell and the difference between the real eternal city and the eternal city on earth. And that is what inspired the City of God, was the sack of Rome in 410. But as historians, we can look back at this and we can have a completely different perspective. No, the city of Rome did not fall and was sacked by the Visigoths because the empire had converted to Christianity and abandoned the pagan gods. That wasn't the reason. And even the reasoning that Augustine gives in The City of God, that wasn't the reason either. We can look back from a historical perspective now and see what was going on in this period of time and see that Rome had just gone through the third century crisis, and Diocletian is able to bring the empire back together for a period of time under tetrarchy, the rule of four. And then they're still fighting amongst people after tetrarchy. Constantine has to invade the east and take on Licinius because he violates the Edict of Milan and starts persecuting Christians again. We can see all this from a historical point of view that this is what was going on. But the major issue and why Rome, the Eternal City, was sacked in 410 is because the Eternal City was vulnerable. That's why it was sacked. And Constantine knew that Rome was vulnerable. That's why Constantine moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. That was the whole purpose, because Constantine foresaw that the city of Rome, the Eternal City, was vulnerable and it was going to be sacked. Constantine understood that the Goths that had that come over the Rhine and Danube river when they were frozen, and all of these Goths came over and in major migrations into the Roman Empire. He understood that many of these Goths were in Constantine's army. He understood that it wasn't only, if it wasn't the Visigoths who sacked Rome, it was going to be the Vandals. It was going to be some of these other Gothic groups, because there were so many huge armies that had crossed over into the Roman Empire across the Rhine and Danube. And Constantine understood this. He understood that the city of Rome, the Eternal City, was vulnerable and it was going to be sacked by somebody. The Visigoths are the only reason the Visigoths sacked it is because they got there first. Constantine understood that you could attack Rome, from the city of Rome, from the south. You could attack it from the east. You could attack it from the north. That the city of Rome was vulnerable. That's why he moved the capital to Constantinople. Constantinople was protected. That was his whole reasoning for moving the capital to the east, to this region of Constantinople. Constantinople was protected on each side. On the three sides that Rome was vulnerable, Constantine, there was an ocean on those three sides in Constantinople. There was a waterway protecting the city of Constantinople all around it. And once Theodosius put up the Theodosian walls on the one side where you could attack Constantinople from the west, Constantinople stood for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years, this city. Constantinople was not finally conquered by the Muslims until the 15th century, because Constantine had the foresight to move the capital to the east, where it was protected by these waterways, and it wasn't as vulnerable as the Eternal City, because he knew that the Eternal City was going to collapse and that it would fall. And it had nothing to do with them converting from paganism into Catholicism. It had nothing to do with the case that Augustine makes in the City of God. The reason that the Visigoths were able to sack Rome in 410 AD is because the Eternal City, was vulnerable. And it was left even more vulnerable when Constantine moves the entire imperial army, the entire imperial court, from Rome to Constantinople. But all of this started from a historical point of view during the crisis of the 3rd century. And you need to understand the crisis of the 3rd century because the United States is in crisis right now. And there are a lot of parallels with Rome in the 3rd century and the issues that they were dealing with that led to the crisis of the 3rd century, and we're dealing with right now. And there's some different things that we're dealing with, but make no doubt about it. The United States right now, in our 3rd century, we're getting ready to celebrate our 250th anniversary. We're in the middle of our 3rd century. And that's why you hear historians who know what they're talking about talk about the uh, around 200-year period of these great empires. Many great empires only lasted, for about 200, 250 years. That there's always this pressure point around that 200-year period. And we're in our 250th year, and we are experiencing major pressure points, major issues of crises. And that's what I want to get into today. And not only today, over the next few weeks, uh, as we approach the 4th of July and the United States 250th anniversary, I'm going to address a new crisis, a different crisis every week until July 4th. I do my podcast twice a week. So, and there's a lot of crises. There's a lot of things, issues and crises that the United States is dealing with right now that make the United States vulnerable. That this is a empire in decline. And if the issues of crises that I'm going to introduce one today that we'll get into here in a moment. But every week we're going to talk about the media, the crisis of the media. Ignorance is on the list. There's a crisis of ignorance in this country. Debt, the crisis of a lack of ethics and morals. There's a lot of crises that we have in this country. And I'm going to talk about a different crisis every podcast as we move through the next few weeks and get into the celebration of our 250th anniversary. I want to read a little bit about what the crisis of the 3rd century was for the Roman Empire here from the Wikipedia page. It says, the crisis of the 3rd century, also known as military anarchy or imperial crisis, was a period of Roman history during the Roman Empire, and it nearly collapsed under the combined pressure of repeated foreign invasions. Okay, so these are the invasions of the Goths coming over the Rhine and the Danube River that were invading the Roman Empire. This is one of their major issues, just like we have, during the Biden administration, record numbers of migration from the South into our country. Same issue. Civil wars. I mean, people, you look at what's going on with this, with the racial divide and all the things going on in this country. We're on the verge of a civil war. Economic disintegration, debt. We're dealing with that. At the height of the crisis, the Roman state split into three distinct competing, polities. The period is usually dated between the end of the Severan dynasty, Severus Alexander 335, and Diocletian. Actually, it ended under Aurelian, who was the emperor that kind of brings all these broken pieces of the empire together. But Aurelian is assassinated, and Diocletian gets credit for ending it because he comes up with the idea for tetrarchy. The crisis began in 235 with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops. And it's crazy because I just brought up Aurelian. So it starts with Severus Alexander being assassinated by his own troops. Aurelian would have gotten credit for ending the crisis, but he's assassinated by his own troops. And that's what tetrarchy does. That's why Diocletian gets credit for ending it, because tetrarchy, he sets up this system, the system that we even use today, that we have a president and we have a vice president. Something happens to the president, then the vice president moves up. Diocletian came up with that idea. The crisis began in 235 with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops. During the following years, the empire saw barbarian invasions and migration into the Roman territory, civil wars, peasant rebellions, political instability, multiple usurpers competing for power. This led to the debasement of currency, all this stuff. I mean, the parallels are there, people. And breaking down of both trade networks, economic productivity, and then also plague and disease. So these were the issues. Many of them, not all of them. I mean, we don't have peasant rebellions in the United States, but we damn sure have currency debasement. We got that. We got problems with migration. We got that. We got problems with trade and economic productivity. We got that. So we're dealing with some different issues that are bringing about the crises of America in our third century. And we're going to talk about what those issues are. One of those issues, and the focus of the remainder of this podcast, is our elections. Our elections are trash in this country. We cannot, call ourselves a democracy, a democracy that other democracies look to as the pinnacle of democracies, when it takes a week in the 21st century, in 2026, for us to get results for our elections. We can't call ourselves a democracy. We can't say that other democracies should look at us as the idea of what democracy should be, when they're counting, with their finger in an ink, put their finger in ink, and they're able to count the paper and come up with the results of an election in a few hours, and it takes us 7 days. We have but that's only one issue. We have some real problems with our elections, and one of the major problems is mail-in voting. This was Donald Trump doing an interview with Sean Hannity last year around August. This was during the summit that he did with Vladimir Putin in Alaska. And then after that summit, Trump did this interview with Sean Hannity. And this is what Trump said that Putin told him in the meeting that they had in Alaska.
Oh, Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said, your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting. He said mail-in voting, every election. He said no country has mail-in voting. It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. And he said that to me. It was very interesting, because we talked about 2020. He said, you won that election by so much. And that's how he got it. He said, and if you would have won, we wouldn't have had a war. You'd have all these millions of people alive now instead of dead. And he said, and you lost it because of mail-in voting. It was a rigged election, but mail-in voting, Sean. Vladimir.
So Putin told him that mail-in voting is the way that you rig elections. Now, would Putin know how to rig elections? Putin would know how to rig elections, I would say. Putin's been president of Russia, for almost 3 decades, I would say. And they have elections. It's not like they don't have elections. But I would say that Putin knows something about rigging elections. And Donald Trump told him that the reason that they're able to rig the elections in the United States is because of mail-in voting. Mail-in voting is a tool for rigging elections, is what Putin said. All right, let's meet Fiona Hill. If you don't know who Fiona Hill is, she's a British-American academic foreign policy advisor. She actually worked in the first Trump administration, but she also testified against him in the impeachment trial, the second impeachment trial, which was all about the phone call with Zelensky and all that stuff. She doesn't like Trump. She hates Trump. Brookings Institute, Harvard PhD. Hill is formerly an official of U.S. national security, specializing in Russian and European affairs. So she specializes in Russian and European affairs. Fiona Hill. Now, remember what Trump says. He says that Putin told him that mail-in voting is the way that you rig elections. Putin would know something about rigging elections. So Fiona Hill, after that interview that Trump does with Sean Hannity, this is around the same time, she goes on Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, and Fiona Hill, the foreign policy expert on Russia and all things Russia. Listen to what she says.
And Putin wants to sow chaos in the American electoral system ahead of the midterms. So, of course, he's laid into this whole issue of mail-in voting. And President Trump asserted in his Fox News interview that there are no countries in the world that allow mail-in voting. Well, Russia allows mail-in voting. And if everybody wants to go out and look, they can look for themselves. In 2020, President Vladimir Putin signed into law Russians being able to vote by mail and also on the internet.
On the internet, too. So Putin signed into law that you're able in Russia. So she says, he says that nobody votes by mail. They vote by mail in Russia. In 2022, Vladimir Putin signed into law, a law making it legal to vote by mail in Russia and also on the internet. Again, Putin's telling Donald Trump how you rig elections. You rig elections with mail-in voting. And Fiona Hill, foreign policy expert, is here supposedly refuting Putin and refuting what Donald Trump is actually saying in the interview. And she says they actually use mail-in voting and voting on the internet. We should bring that over, too, because they do it in Russia, is what she says.
That allow mail-in voting. Well, Russia allows mail-in voting. And if everybody wants to go out and look, they can look for themselves. In 2020, President Vladimir Putin signed into law Russians being able to vote by mail and also on the internet. And more than 30 other countries also allow some forms of mail-in voting. So it's just not true that other countries, including Russia, don't use this. It's a pure, blatant piece of manipulation. And that's the kind of thing that Putin likes to do.
And of course, I don't think you would endorse the outcome of that voting system and that those elections are rigged in Russia, correct?
Of course.
Wow. Wow. Margaret Brennan says you wouldn't endorse Russia's elections as being fair. You're saying that Russia uses mail-in voting and Putin signed a law saying, so she's actually agreeing with Poe. Well, of course, they're not fair. Of course, Russia's elections are rigged. Of course, I wouldn't endorse Russia's elections as being fair. So what Putin is saying is right. Yes, Putin is implementing, according to you, Fiona Hill, that one of the tools that Russia, who doesn't have fair elections, that you admit to, one of the tools that Putin is using to manipulate and rig elections is mail-in voting. And she admits it here. And she only has to admit it because Margaret Brennan asked the follow-up question. Just egg all over her face because they know that mail-in voting is how you rig elections, just like Putin said, just like Putin does.
Don't use this. It's a pure, blatant piece of manipulation. And that's the kind of thing that Putin likes to do.
And of course, I don't think you would endorse the outcome of that voting system and that those elections are rigged in Russia, correct?
Of course. And
of course they're rigged. Of course they're rigged. Of course they're rigged because they use mail-in voting, just like Putin said. So Donald Trump last week got into this conversation about our fraudulent and corrupt election system, which they are. Our election in this country are fraudulent. We need electoral reforms in a bad way. And I'm not just talking about the SAVE Act. We need real electoral reforms in this country. And Donald Trump's been talking about this even before the 2020 election. They started getting into the 2020 election, which was rigged. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, only, I'm just going to leave that there because we'll talk more about it here in a moment. But even before in 2016, Donald Trump was talking about the elections being rigged and them rigging it for Hillary Clinton. He's been talking about rigged elections for forever. So this doesn't just have anything to do with the 2020 election. But in this interview, you've probably already seen the clip where Donald Trump gets up and walks off and it makes it look like he stormed out of the interview. You can see here the entire video is almost 50 minutes long and he doesn't get up until the very end. So he'd already given her, 45, 50 minutes before he gets up and storms out on her. I don't even know why he's sitting down with this idiot. Anyway, they get into the conversation about the elections and he brings up California because California is what we're talking about here. It took a week for them to count the election, count the votes and certify the election, completely third world and banana republic style stuff. Because we use mail-in voting here in California, but we not only use mail-in voting. Yeah, you have 7 days to get. I mean, do you know how much potential fraud? Putin would love that. I wonder if Putin allows 7 days for the ballots to come in elections in Russia, but we do here in California. Anyway, let's get into this clip of Donald Trump and Kristen Welker getting into this conversation.
People like stupid Biden, he's not smart enough to know what's going on, but people that surrounded him, surrounded his beautiful, resolute desk in the Oval Office. What they did to the lives of people, they destroyed people. They sent people to jail who did nothing wrong.
All right, just to be very clear, there's no evidence of what you're saying, but let
There's
me
a lot
ask you
of
about
evidence.
Todd Blanche.
There's no evidence.
Listen
No
to me.
evidence.
Let's talk
There's
about Todd
tremendous
Blanche.
evidence. There's nothing but
No evidence.
The election was rigged. It was a dirty election.
Mr.
And it's
President,
happening again right now in California.
You've never presented evidence.
It's happening.
No
right
evidence. You
now
never
in
presented any
California.
evidence. So you're going to notice this narrative. And so this is the narrative that you're going to hear from many people over and over again. And this is what they say. There's no evidence. You haven't presented any evidence. And, you're just saying it. Well, of course, you take 7 days to count an election. And of course, it's going to be difficult to find any evidence. Why is there even any speculation that there's fraud going on and there's rigging going on? You should want to remove all of that. You should want to remove all speculation. And the longer you take to certify an election and count the votes, the more speculation there's going to be of fraud. But that's the narrative you're going to hear over and over again. No evidence, no evidence.
Nothing but evidence. The election was rigged
in a court of law. So the reason that in 2020 it hasn't been presented in a court of law is because there's something called standing, Kristen Welker. Because the Democrats, when they went into the courtroom, they issued motions to dismiss this before the evidentiary process, before you can present any evidence at all. They introduced motions to dismiss this case on standing, that you have no standing to bring this case, and then the judge throws it out. And that happened each time. Even the case that the state of Pennsylvania tried to take to the Supreme Court about the election rules being changed by outside of the legislature, well, where the Constitution states clearly that the only people who can make election laws is the legislature, and you do things that are outside that, but the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case. That doesn't mean that there isn't any evidence. It means that the Supreme Court don't want to hear the evidence. And many other courts didn't want to hear the evidence based on standing. That doesn't mean that there was no evidence and evidence wasn't attempted to be presented in court.
Let me ask you about Todd Blanche. Listen
to me.
Let's talk
There's
about Todd
tremendous
Blanche.
evidence. There's nothing but evidence. The election was rigged.
It's not been presented in a court of law.
And it's happening again right now in
You've
California.
never presented evidence.
It's happening
the
right now in California.
Rigged.
Right now, it's look at what's happening in California.
Look at what's happening in California.
Republicans are doing well in California.
Took
7 days.
They're dropping fast because it's a rigged election. Let me tell you, it's 4 days. And they aren't even close to coming up with it. You know why they're doing that? Because
that's how they count the votes in California. I love that line. That's how they count the votes in Russia, lady. That's how they count the votes in Russia, too. That's how they count the votes in California. It's hilarious.
They're dropping fast because it's a rigged election. Let me tell you, it's 4 days. And they aren't even close to coming up with it. You know why they're doing that? Because they're cheating on the election.
Do you have evidence?
Do you have evidence?
Well,
you have evidence? That's how they count the votes in California. Do you have evidence? No, there's no evidence. There's no evidence because you're taking 7 days, a week to certify the election. No, I mean, that also gives you a week to hide all the evidence. What are you talking about here? Do you have any evidence? Do you have any evidence? That's the way they count. That's the way they do things in California.
Why they're doing that? Because they're cheating on the election.
Do you have evidence to support
All I
that?
have to do is look. All I have to do is
that's
look.
not
And I
evidence.
listen. And I listen to people. And let's see what happens.
There needs to be
So that's not
investigations.
evidence.
There needs to be investigations, Kristen. Why aren't you calling for investigation? Oh, saying that, oh, there's no evidence. So you don't have any evidence. There's no evidence. There needs to be investigations. I tell you that. There should definitely be investigations because just like Putin said, and just like Fiona Hill said, mail-in voting is the way that you rig elections. It shouldn't take 7 days in 2026 to certify an election with all these mail-in votes. It takes 7 days 7 days. Come on, in state. In a day, I can mail something today and it could be in San Francisco, the northern part of this state tomorrow. What are you talking about? 7 days? Come on.
I think it's appropriate.
That's how they
that
count the votes.
That's how they do it.
That they have an election, and 5 days later, they're nowhere close to picking a
State
winner.
and local officials acknowledge they are slow. They're urging.
Oh, they acknowledge that they're slow.
the votes to be counted quickly. That's how they vote
They're
in
crooked,
California.
just
That's how
like
you do
you're
it.
crooked. Your press is crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked.
To be fair, I'm not crooked, but let's.
Yeah, you're
let's
crooked.
You
continue.
play right into their hands. and
Let's continue.
You're either crooked or you're stupid.
Let's
you play
continue.
right into their hands
Both.
with this rap. You know that these elections are rigged. Your network knows that they're rigged. You know that I won an election in a landslide, and I got 94% bad press.
But Mr. President,
you know why I
you've
got
never
that?
presented
Because you have no
evidence.
credibility.
But you've never presented evidence that it was rigged. Let's keep talking about. I want to talk about Todd.
You
Blanche.
have more evidence. There's more evidence than ever presented.
Let's talk
Your
about
elections
you
in
went
this
to
country. We're
court.
like a third world country.
We're like a third world
Your
country.
Elections are crooked, and you're crooked, and
But
Meet
Mr.
the Press is crooked,
Mr.
and so
President-
is ABC.
And so, he's right. I'm sorry. He's right that our elections are crooked. This is after the fact. And you saw this from all of the media. So that's the media's job. The media's job and what Kristen Welker is doing here, she has to run cover and say that the elections are fair, because if people lose faith in the elections, they lose faith in the entire system. This is one of the crises that are facing the United States of America right now, because people don't want to participate in a fraudulent system. It's obviously fraudulent. So she has to run cover, because the entire system will break down if she doesn't run cover. And she wasn't the only one running cover. All of the media, you saw them running cover. Oh, you can't doubt the elections. This is the way they do things in California. They just take 7 days to mail something in California and get out of here. So that's her motive. And the entire media, you saw this, you're going to see it here. Manu Raju from CNN questioning the Speaker of the House over what Trump said to Kristen Welker. And it's not just Trump and Kristen Welker. Everyone was talking about this over the week period that it took from the night of the election 2 Tuesdays ago, or a Tuesday ago, and them finally certifying these elections. And meanwhile, all of the mail-in votes coming just happens to be overwhelmingly Democrats. Overwhelmingly Democrats, all of the mail-in voting that's coming over that 7-day period. So Manu Raju's questioning the Speaker of the House about it. Take a listen.
The president keeps saying that there's election fraud in the California mayor's race. What evidence is there to prove
What
that?
evidence?
Tell me, Manu. They are counting votes weeks after the election. We have entire nations with huge populations, like India, that can count their votes in 24
So
to 48
you're saying
hours.
it's rigged like the president?
I'm
Yes.
not saying it's
Yes.
rigged. I'm saying it stinks to high heaven, and everybody knows that.
It stinks.
Let's remove the appearance of impropriety.
Absolutely, Speaker. Absolutely, Speaker Johnson. Even if you say, okay, you don't have any evidence, why is there speculation? Why is there even any doubt? Why is anybody even questioning it? Because it takes 7 days to mail something in California. No other state takes 7 days to mail something, but in California, it takes 7 days to mail something. That's why there's speculation. That's why there's people doubting it. And even if you don't have any evidence, you should remove that doubt. You should remove that speculation. And you're going to tell me in 2026 you can't do that. Oh, it's just the way we do things in California. Bogus. California, this is the way they do things, and this is what Democrats have had unchallenged power in this state for 2 decades. That no one has been able to challenge their power, because that's just the way they do things. like they do things in Russia.
We have entire nations with huge populations, like India, that can count their votes in 24 to 40
You're saying
hours.
it's rigged like the president?
I'm not saying it's rigged. I'm saying it stinks to high heaven, and everybody knows that. Let's remove the appearance of impropriety. Let's have what a concept. Let's have votes on an election the day of the election. That's what many states are able to do. I think California is playing around with this.
But what evidence is there to prove?
What evidence? What evidence? What evidence? What evidence?
It's so diabolical and so far upstream it is impossible to prove. But I think everybody knows instinctively something is wrong here. And that's a concern. We need people to believe in the integrity of our election system. It is critical to maintain a constitutional republic. We're going to keep working to pass the Save America Act because it requires, as you know, proof of citizenship. And
we need more than the SAVE Act, Mr. Speaker. We need more because it's not just California. It's not. We've had problems with our elections for quite a while, and I have enough time that we're going to get into it. I'm going to show you because this is a major point of crises in this country in our 250th year as a nation. Elections. I want to point out Chris Cuomo. I thought this was pretty funny here because he's doing the same job as the media, as the rest of the media. His job, as people are doubting, more and more people are doubting and noticing what's going on. His job, just like Kristen Welker, just like the other talking heads on all the other media stations, is to remove that doubt, is to restore the confidence and trust that you would have in these elections. I don't know why anyone would have confidence and faith and trust in our elections, but his job is to do that. So he does a segment on this, and take a listen to what he says.
The Democrats are at it again. They're trying to steal the two races from Republicans. Here we go with the very late and massive numbers of mail-in ballots, okay? So unlike the president, let's actually analyze why it takes California so long. First, it's the biggest state, 23 million registered voters.
Yeah, what does that mean? It's the biggest state. You just heard Speaker Johnson say that they count votes in 24 hours in India. Is California bigger than India? No, it's the biggest state.
Analyze why it takes California so long. First, it's the biggest state, 23 million registered voters. Second, mail-in voting is a big part of their system.
Of course it is. It's a big part of their system. It's a big part of Putin's system. Of course it's a big part of the system. Mail-in voting. That's how you rig elections. That's how Putin rigs elections. What are we talking about here?
First, it's the biggest state, 23 million registered voters. Second, mail-in voting is a big part of their system. And their mail-in voting has an extended period of allowance, meaning if it's marked by Election Day, it can come in as many as 7 days after that. Why would it? I don't know. I don't know what's going on with the postal system, but
why would it? I don't know. I don't know what's going on with the postal system. Well, let's ask that question before you move on anywhere else. Fredo, Chris Cuomo, before you go on to anything else, let's answer that question. What's going on with the postal system? Why does it take 7 days for the ballot to be counted after it's postmarked on Election Day? Why is it so I don't know what's going on with the postal system. Well, let's answer that question first. Before you move on to anything else, what's going on with the postal system? It's a clown show.
Period of allowance, meaning if it's marked by Election Day, it can come in as many as 7 days after that. Why would it? I don't know. I don't know what's going on with the postal system, but that's a big allowance.
Yeah, that is a big allowance, buddy. That's a big allowance. You should try to figure out, since you're a journalist and you have all those resources at your side, you should try to figure out what's going on with the postal system. These people are clowns. All right, on The View, again, doing the job of the media and many of these people are Democrats. They're all Democrats. Chris Cuomo, Democrat, all these people, all the people in the media, they're all Democrats. So the Democrats are winning. The Democrats are in control of California by using mail-in ballots. So they got to defend that. Not only defend the trust and the trust that people have in the elections, but also they're defending their political side, the Democratic Party. They started having this conversation on The View, and I want you to listen to what they said.
He's never provided any credible evidence.
No evidence.
Fraud. I guess everybody's upset because
there's not only election fraud. You can rig elections by several different ways. not only election fraud, but no evidence.
He's never provided any credible evidence of election fraud. You know, I guess everybody's upset because Spencer Pratt didn't do what they all thought he was going to do. They all thought he was going to walk away with it, and it didn't happen. So why is it every time they lose, it's election fraud?
And listen to what she said. Every time they lose, I'm telling you, I just said that all of the media is aligned with the Democrats. So when she's saying they, she's talking about Republicans, and we would be Democrats. They're all aligned with the Democrats, and so every time they lose, that it's rigged. It's not every time they lose. I'm going to show you many times where Democrats, your side, we were complaining about rigged elections. But we'll get there in a moment.
They lose, it's election fraud. And every time we win, it's election fraud. Why is it always fraud? What do you make of this?
Well, that right there is kind of the point. You don't have a lot of Republicans screaming that the 2024 election was stolen because Donald Trump won.
Yeah.
But listen, Kristen Walken...
That's a huge problem, what she's saying. And we're going to get to that problem, too. Because Democrats, as I'm going to show you here in a moment, they've complained about many elections. They've complained about many elections and said that they were rigged and they were fraudulent. And Republicans, even though some of these elections that Democrats complained about that were rigged and fraudulent were actually rigged and fraudulent, for real. And Republicans had won. And when Republicans won, even though the election was rigged and fraud, Republicans didn't want to do anything about the rigged and fraud elections because they had won. Now, the rigged and fraud elections are more benefiting Democrats. And so Democrats don't want to do anything to fix the rigged and fraud elections. We need to have, this is a crisis. This is a crisis that the United States is facing in our 250th anniversary. And you have to have integrity. You have to be able to stand up and say that rigged elections aren't good if a Democrat wins or if my side wins. And it doesn't matter if my side wins. If the election is rigged, I need to stand up for free and fair elections. And what this bobblehead is saying is absolutely true. Republicans win. They don't want to say anything about fraudulent elections. I'm not saying 2024 was fraud. Kamala got her butt beat, and Democrats were in charge. So if there was fraud, of course they were using it. But the point I'm making is that both sides cheat. Both sides benefit from rigged elections. And it shouldn't matter if your side wins or not. You should stand up for free and fair elections.
This.
Well, that right there is kind of the point. You don't have a lot of Republicans screaming that the 2024 election was stolen because Donald Trump won.
Yeah.
But listen, Kristen Walker did such a phenomenal job there. And I would point out, she did not bring up the election of 2020 being stolen. The president launched into this tirade.
Because of California.
Folks who still are believing these lies, you've had 6 years to prove that. You have had countless times to put up or shut up, and we have seen no credible evidence.
So no credible evidence. Again, they changed the laws in Pennsylvania outside of the legislature to allow mail-in voting. They did the same thing. I believe that they did outside of the legislature in Georgia as well for mail-in voting in 2020. 2020 was, how can you believe anything was on the up and up in 2020? Nothing in 2020 was on the up and up. From COVID to Black Lives Matter to saying to shutting down schools and making people wearing masks. None of it was on the up and up. And you think the election was? No, they used COVID to change the laws in all of these different states to allow mail-in voting, which mail-in voting, as Putin says, and as Fiona Hill says, mail-in voting is how you rig elections. So they changed the laws in these states so they can allow more mail-in voting, which mail-in voting, as Putin and Fiona Hill says, is how you rig elections. So keep saying that, there's no evidence that it was the fairest election. Nobody believes that.
Who still are believing these lies, you've had 6 years to prove that. You have had countless times to put up or shut up, and we have seen no credible evidence. But the problem is it sticks with people. As many as 60% of Republicans still believe the 2020 election was stolen.
I'm surprised it's that low. I'm surprised that 40% of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was fair. 40% of Republicans believe it was fair, I guess.
To put up or shut up, and we have seen no credible evidence. But the problem is it sticks with people. As many as 60% of Republicans still believe the 2020 election was stolen.
So yeah. Anyway, these people live in an alternate reality, and this gets a little bit off topic, but I want to show this clip because we're talking about the View and we're talking about 2020 and the election in 2020, and I just want to just show you how delusional these people are. This is Sunny Hostin from The View, and they start getting into talking about January 6th and the BLM riots and mayhem that took place in 2020. And I want you to listen to what Sunny Hostin says here.
I just think we need to make it clear that there can be no comparison between the Black Lives Matter movement and what we saw on January 6th. So I just want to make that clear. There were very limited destruction of property and violence during the uprising.
I want to be. She says, so they edited this. I didn't know that this clip was edited, but she says that there was very little violence and destruction of property during BLM during 2020. That's how they remember things. She also goes into in this clip saying that there were no threats to the president's life. On the very first night of the BLM riots in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump was rushed to his underground bunker. Tons of Park Services officers were injured during that mayhem. They tried to burn down St. John's Church across from Lafayette Square. These people were delusional. They're absolutely delusional. But Democrats have complained about many different elections, and the most notable is 2020. 2020, again, Democrats complained after this election because this election was a rigged election. It was absolutely rigged. And I'm sorry. I support Republicans. I vote for Republicans. I am a conservative, but I'm not going to lie and say that the 2000 election was fair just because Republicans won. Matter of fact, when in the 2000 election, I wasn't a conservative and wasn't a Republican. I was more on the liberal side. I voted for Bill Clinton. I voted for Ralph Nader in this particular election. That's how left I was back then. But you want to know something? Back in 2000, you want to know who else was a Democrat? Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a Democrat back in 2000. And Donald Trump understands very well what happened in 2000 in the 2000 election. And he understands how rigged this election was and what happened in this election. That's why when he comes on the scene in 2016, he's talking about how rigged the elections were even before they rigged it in 2020. He understood from a Democrat perspective, and all the Democrats understood back in 2000 about our rigged elections and how they rigged the election using the felony purge list in Florida, the brother of the candidate and the Secretary of State being the head of his campaign, pulling thousands of minorities off of the voter rolls, claiming that they were felons. I mean, the separation of votes in Florida between the two candidates, between Al Gore and George Bush, was less than 600, something like 530 votes, and they took thousands of minority voters off the rolls in Florida, claiming that they were felons. It was absolutely rigged. Trump understood it was rigged. He knew that it was rigged. Democrats understood that it was rigged. This is at January 6th, 2001, when Al Gore, as the vice president, has to preside over the certification of the election after it had just been stolen from him. And this is a clip of Jesse Jackson Jr., but every single Democrat tried to object to this election, that this election was stolen and that it was fraudulent. But now that they're winning using the mail-in ballots and everything, the election's fair. It's fair and square now.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, arise?
Mr. President, I have an objection.
Is the gentleman's objection in writing and signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator?
Yes, sir, I have signed it.
It's not signed by a senator, though. It's not signed by a senator, though. And that's the law before they changed the law after 2020. If 2020 wasn't rigged, why'd you have to change the law after 2020? But the law was one member of the House and one senator to raise an objection. The reason that that no senator joins any member of the House, and all the members of the House were requesting from the senators, please join me in this objection. Join me in this objection. No senator would join a member of the House in 2001 to join in the objection so they could object because Al Gore had asked them. Al Gore had personally asked all the Democrats in the Senate, please don't join a member of the House to object. Let's get this over with. We need to get this over with. That was Al Gore's point of view. But the reason that Al Gore, and this is something that's interesting because in the January 6th hearing, they brought these people to testify and say, well, if Mike Pence had the authority just to throw out the election after 2020, then Al Gore would have had the authority to throw out the election in 2001. But the difference is that Trump had a senator. Trump had Ted Cruz with a member of the House that were objecting to, and other senators were going to join members of the House in 2020. That's the difference between Mike Pence and Al Gore. Al Gore went to the members of the Senate and asked them not to join. And so no members of the House had a member of the Senate signature as well. So that's why that's why Al Gore couldn't object. But Mike Pence, the situation with Mike Pence was totally different because you had a senator and a member of the House in 2021. But they didn't have that.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, arise.
Mr. President, I have an objection.
Is the gentleman's objection in writing and signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator?
Yes, sir, I have signed it.
You have a senator.
Is the objection signed by a senator?
No.
Mr. President, I am objecting to...
Now, you don't have a senator, we're not going to listen to you. So basically he shuts him down, tells him, you don't have a senator, we're not going to listen to you. And so same thing happens in 2004, the very next election, which they stole again. It was absolutely rigged. The 2004 election was rigged in Ohio this time. In the 2000 election, it came down to one state, Florida. In the 2004 election, just 4 years later, when George Bush is running against his skull and bones fraternity brother. And John Kerry concedes the next morning, as the votes were still coming in Ohio. They rigged it in Ohio in 2000. This time, as they're certifying the election on January 6th, 2005, Dick Cheney is presiding over the certification of the elections. Members of the Democrats, the election was rigged. The election was rigged. You guys rigged it. It's a rigged election. Republicans, even though it was rigged, Republicans didn't even want to look at the facts. They didn't want to look at the facts. Back in 2004, 2005, when this election went on, I was more on the Democrat side, the liberal side. You want to know who was also on the Democrat side back in 2005, back in 2004? This guy, Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a Democrat. So he understood very well what was going on with the election in 2005 and 2004 and the certification in 2005. That's why when he comes on the scene in 2016, he's screaming about rigged elections. They're gonna rig it. And they do it on both sides. They do it on both sides. But this is 2005, January 6th. And again, members of the House are frantically looking for members of the Senate to join them so they could object to the election. Al Gore is not the president of the Senate now. It's Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney doesn't have the type of influence that Al Gore had 4 years earlier. So they actually get a member of the Senate this time. Democrat Senator from California, Barbara Boxer, joined a member of the House, and they were able to object to Ohio's election and electoral votes. These are Democrats objecting to, when Barbara Boxer joins a member of the House in 2005 to object to Ohio's elections. This is the first time a senator had joined a member of the House to object to electoral votes in over 100 years. It had never been done. It's done in 2004, and then it's done again in 2021, or it done in 2005, and then done again in 2021. That's why this is a crisis, people. They have to change the law after 2021. So you needed more. It had to have a larger threshold than just one senator and one member of the House. And that's not going to do it either. You're going to be seeing this a lot. But Barbara Boxer joins the member of the House, and they're able to object to Ohio's electoral votes. Democrats objecting to rigged elections. They said it was rigged, it was rigged, it was rigged. But now, all of a sudden, they're all fair because we got the mail-in votes.
After which the chair will put the question, shall the objection be sustained? The clerk will report the objection made in the joint session.
Ms. Tubb Jones, a representative from Ohio, and Mrs. Boxer, a senator from California, object to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Ohio on the ground that they were not under all of the known circumstances regularly given.
Why did voters in poor and predominantly African American communities have disproportionately long waits? Why in Franklin County did election officials use only 2,798 machines when they needed 5,000? Why did they hold back 68 machines in warehouses? 68 machines that were in working order. Why were 42 of those machines predominantly in African American communities? Why did in the Columbus area alone an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 voters leave polling places out of frustration without having voted? How many more never bothered to vote after they heard this because they had to take care of their families, or they had a job, or they were sick, or their legs ached after waiting for hours?
It's wrong. And they rigged Ohio just like they rigged Florida 2 years before that, just like they rigged the 2020 election. Like I'm saying, this is not a partisan issue. This is not a partisan issue. We need national electoral reform. National elections should probably have a holiday so people can go and vote. We need to honestly have voter ID. I would even bring back literacy tests. You should at least be able to know there's 100 senators in the Senate, 435 members of the Congress, 50 states. You should at least be able to know that. You should at least be able to pass the citizenship test that new citizens have to take to know about this country to vote. I mean, they have to take that test to vote. Why shouldn't every citizen have to take that test to vote? I would bring back literacy tests, but even if you didn't do that, we need serious electoral reforms because our elections in this country are a crisis. It's only one of many crises. Next week, we're going to get back into another crisis that the United States is facing in our 250th anniversary of being a nation. And the question is, will we survive? Will this United States survive as long as Constantinople did, protected by its water barriers and the Theodosian walls were able to last for 1,000 years? Will we last 1,000 years? Or are we headed for demise? We'll be back on Monday. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.